stop staring at it. It's only going to be for a month, I promise. Yes, I'm doing Movember again. Get used to it. What's happening, everybody? Justin, Bridgewater's finest on YouTube, Blockbuster_guy on Twitter, fueled as always by the incredible folks at NerdTees, and welcome to the Division semi-final round of my weekly CFL football pick show for the 2019 CFL regular season and now CFL postseason. Now, the playoff videos will differ a little bit from the ones in the regular season, especially at the end, where I've got a little something extra special for you. But what we'll do, we will talk about how our regular season ended, not on the best note that it could have, but not on a terrible note either. And then we will get in to the CFL playoffs. So if you'll recall, we needed a pretty darn good week to achieve our stretch goal of being 60% overall by the end of the CFL regular season. We did not quite get there in week 21. We wound up going 7-5 across all of the CFL picks, and that's including going 0 for 3 on the very first game, and that's what I get for betting on the Ottawa REDBLACKS. Went 0-3 in that game. Went 7-2 afterwards. So, I mean, you take that one game out, it was a darn successful week. Unfortunately, we can't quite operate that way. So, 7-5, again, grand total, 144, 98, and 1 on the season as a whole, 59.26%. So we just fell short of that 60% clip. Straight up, we finished the regular season at 70%. That goal was achieved, 57-24. Against the spread, 60%. That goal was achieved. Finished 49-31 with a single push. Over-under, we finished the season, the 5 games under 500, which we were before. That's only 47%, but that's honestly not that far off of par for the course as far as I'm concerned with totals. Now, the position that this leaves us in to try to get to 60% by the end of the season, by the end of the playoffs, looks like this. I have to go 11-4. So that's what, there's 5 games left. I have to go at least 2-1 in each of them, and one of those games I have to sweep. That's not unachievable in the least. We can do that. We've shown that we can do that this season. I think we're going to do it. We go 11-4, we're money. We're 60% for the year. So here is how our playoff bracket wound up looking after the couple of important games that took place in the last week of the regular season. In the East Division, Edmonton is crossing over as the third competitor in the East. Edmonton will travel to Montreal this week to take on the Alouettes. The winner of that game then goes to Hamilton next week to take on the Ticats, and the winner of that game goes to the Grey Cup representing the East. In the West Division, we've got Winnipeg traveling to Calgary to take on the Stampeders. That game happens this week. The winner of that game then travels to Saskatchewan to take on the Roughriders, who will host, and the winner of that game will represent the West. Get it, got it, good, and since you understood, we'll move on to a really exciting piece of news from last week. I was the number 1 CFL fantasy football player in this pool, in this official Atlantic Schooners Fantasy Football League. I was the number 1 player last week. Holy cow. That's not something that I think I achieved all season long. I think I would have recalled if something like that would have happened, but I pulled in 99.7 points in week 21, a very tumultuous week because who knows who's even going to be starting and who's not, but I had the number 1 fantasy lineup last week, and it pulled me inside the top 20 to end the regular season. And that's tremendously exciting because we were down all the way into like the early 30s at one point. I think we were like 33, 34. And in week 21, my fantasy MVP, definitely Brian Burnham. He didn't catch Brandon Banks for the CFL receiving lead, but he did put up 91 yards on 7 catches, found the end zone in that season finale for BC. That's 22.1 fantasy points on his own. My fantasy lineup, as well as a couple of other little tidbits, will appear at the end of the video. So as I mentioned, our schedule this week, it's only 2 games, of course. Edmonton is in Montreal and Winnipeg is in Calgary. We will start in Montreal with the East semifinal, and you'll see how I'm going to go about doing these playoff picks. The Eskimos finished the regular season with a record of 8-10, but came to a skid at the end of the season, losing their final 2 straight games, including a 23-13 decision last week in Saskatchewan against the Roughriders. Now, that was a game that Saskatchewan had to win in order to solidify and ensure that they got that first round bye. So I don't exactly blame Edmonton for losing that game, especially where they sat Trevor Harris and CJ Gable was not in the lineup. All kinds of things happened there. What is concerning to me is the fact that the last 4 games of Edmonton's regular season, whenever they played anybody that had a team, they were not able to win those games. They did win 1 of their final 4 games. That was a game against BC. But you have back-to-back losses in a home-and-home against Saskatchewan, and then a loss in Hamilton as well. Now, again, those are very good football teams, but Edmonton by that point was a team that kind of knew that they were going to the postseason, and their play was not really reflective of a team that was starting to play their best heading into the playoffs. Not to mention they were outscored in those games on average by 8 full points, 25-17. If I'm the Eskimos, I think the biggest area that I'm looking to exploit in this game against Montreal is winning on the line of scrimmage, especially while I'm on offense. The Eskimos allowed the fewest sacks in the CFL this season, just 25 sacks allowed in 18 games. And it's not like they've got this uber mobile quarterbacks back there. It's Trevor Harris or Logan Kilgore. Neither one of them are fantastic rushing quarterbacks. So the fact they only gave up 25 sacks in 18 games, which is like, I think, one and a third per game or somewhere in that area, it's a testament to how good that offensive line is. And the fact that Montreal was only able to record a CFL low 27 sacks this season, I don't expect Montreal to get to the quarterback all that frequently, and it may give Trevor Harris that extra half second, 3/4 of a second to make a play behind a pretty good offensive line. My big area of concern for Edmonton is the same area of concern that I've had with them all season. It's their lack of finishing power. This is an offense that can move the ball very, very well. But in terms of actually putting the football in the end zone, the thing that you are trying to do, Edmonton with just 37 touchdowns on the season, which seems like a big number, it's really not. It was the second fewest in the CFL, and they scored the third fewest total points in the CFL. The Alouettes finished the regular season at 10-8, winners of their final game in the last week of the season, a 10-point decision against Ottawa. That game was in Ottawa, so not really the greatest tune-up, certainly not from the defensive side of things, but hey, they got the win. That's what matters. Montreal was even money in their final 4 games down the stretch, going 2-2. However, they were outscored in those games on average 32-30. So very high-scoring football games down the stretch here for the Alouettes. That was a win in Ottawa and a win against Toronto, so they were 2 non-playoff wins. Their losses came against Hamilton and in Winnipeg. For the Alouettes, I think their biggest area to exploit is to use a Mike Babcock quote, starting on time. And what I mean by that is Montreal this season had the second highest yards per play on first down. So starting on time means you're starting a new drive, you're starting a new set of downs, get a good chunk of yardage, put yourself in a good position to make that second down conversion, or maybe you won't even need a second down conversion. Edmonton had the second worst yards allowed on first down this season. In both cases, Montreal gained and Edmonton allowed. It's right around 7 yards per play. So if Montreal can average 7 yards per play, maybe even pushing 8 yards per play on first down, they're going to put themselves in good positions to sustain drives and put points on the board. The biggest area of concern for Montreal, easily for me, is their secondary. They had the highest opponent completion percentage allowed this season, 73.6% to opposing quarterbacks. Trevor Harris is going to have a good football game in this game, win or lose for the Eskimos. They also allowed the most passing yardage this season, more than the non-playoff teams, which is not great. 316 yards on average allowed. These two teams had 2 head-to-head matchups this season, and they were split evenly 1-1. Edmonton picked up a 32-25 victory in Edmonton all the way back in the first week of the regular season. These were during, of course, the dark times, the pre-Vernon Adams times. Montreal avenged that loss a couple of weeks later in Week 6 in Montreal, picking up a 20-10 victory. The Alouettes were 6-3 at home this season, though only outscored opponents on average by a single point, 25-24, but they've got quality wins on their home field. You're talking Hamilton, Edmonton, like we mentioned, Winnipeg, and Calgary. They beat all 4 of those playoff teams in their home building this season. The Eskimos just 3-6 on the road in 2019, outscored by an average of 4 points, 24-20, and they only beat non-playoff teams on the road. They did not beat a playoff team in that team's own building. Their closest loss came back in week 8. That was when they visited Calgary. They lost that game by 6. So on road games against playoff opponents, they lost every single game by at least 6 points. Montreal was also even money against the West Division this year at 5-5, had wins over Edmonton. They beat Calgary twice this season, 2 major games against the Stampeders, and they also beat the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. So they got quality wins against the West, and they were even money. Edmonton had a good season against the East Division. They went 5-3 in the 8 games, outscored their opponents on average by a couple of points, but their only playoff team win was once again way back in week 1 when they beat Montreal. The one thing I cannot deny on the Edmonton Eskimos side of things is their advantage in playoff experience. Trevor Harris has done this before. Greg Ellingson has done this before. There are members on that defensive side that have been in this position before. You're talking experience edge, it 100% goes to the Edmonton Eskimos, and I'm not trying to deny that or not trying to diminish that. But what I also can't deny or diminish is what I have seen in 2019 in a vacuum. And what I've seen in 2019 in a vacuum is the Edmonton Eskimos are not good enough on the road. They're not good enough on the road to cross the country, go into a team that has played incredibly well against better teams than them in their own building and beaten better teams than them. I've been saying for weeks now, I believe in Vernon Adams, and that rings true here. I like the Montreal Alouettes at home this week to beat the Edmonton Eskimos. The crossover struggles continue from west to east. I like Montreal to beat the Eskimos. On the line, Montreal are 1.5 favorites, completely understandable. I like them to win. That's a very small price for me to pay. So I'm going to lay that 1.5 and take the Alouettes minus 1.5. Total in the game set at 50 points. I actually only have this capped around a high 40. I realize this is going against the trend specifically for Montreal. So Montreal playing at home, Edmonton away. They combined only hit 6 overs out of 18. So that's a pretty decent trend towards the under. I personally capped it on the under. I think it's going to be a sweat one way or the other, but I'm actually going to go under on this total. We're going to stay under 50 points in the East semifinal of Edmonton and Montreal. And before we move on to Calgary and the West semifinal, I will of course take this opportunity, as I always do, to pump the tires of my great friends at NerdTees. Ladies and gentlemen, nerdtees.ca is the website you need to be visiting if you haven't started your Christmas shopping yet. You're going to want to use that promo code of BWFinest, and you are going to save 15% at checkout, and you're going to get free shipping on any order in Canada over $75, which is not difficult to do, and there's so much great stuff. Today's blend is Kiwilicious. I've talked about it quite a bit. Fantastic scent, fantastic taste. It's Kiwilicious. Reminds me of warmer days than it is right now. Nerdtees.ca, promo code BWFinest, save your 15%, get your free shipping in Canada, get your excellent conversion rate if you're in the United States, find yourself something to love, or find someone you love something to love. You can do it on nerdtees.ca. So now that you know how I'm going to be breaking down the games, at least the games this week, let's go to Calgary. Winnipeg Blue Bombers traveling to Calgary to take on the Stamps. Winnipeg finished their season on the bye last week, but they did win their final football game to finish the season at 11-7. That was a 1-point victory over these Calgary Stampeders back in week 20. Now, like Montreal, Winnipeg was only even money in their final 4 games of the season, and they were outscored by an average of 2 points. That was 28-26. They had that win against Calgary. They also had a win against Montreal. Both of those games, of course, happening in Winnipeg. Now, the 2 road games that they had in their last 4, they traveled to playoff opponents at Calgary and at Saskatchewan. They came up on the short end of both of those games. If there's an area for the Bombers to exploit in this game, I believe it's on special teams. Calgary ranks near the dead bottom of this league in terms of average kick return allowed, average punt return allowed, and they have allowed 5 kick return touchdowns over this past season. That is worst in the CFL. Winnipeg's got some explosive players on the offensive side that they can throw on to special teams. I think this is an area in what's going to be a game of inches, a very close football game, I think. Special teams could be an area where Winnipeg could give themselves a shot. Also, a little similarly to Montreal, my big area of concern for the Blue Bombers is on the secondary. They allowed an average of better than 300 yards per game passing to their opponents this season, and no secondary, no defense was thrown on as much as the Winnipeg Blue Bombers were. Now, part of that is their run defense is really good. I think it was the best in the CFL. So teams maybe felt they couldn't run on them. But what that also displays to me is teams were not afraid to throw on the Winnipeg Blue Bombers secondary, 661 times to be specific. Calgary also finished their season on a winning note. Despite the fact that they couldn't get the bye week, they still wanted to win that football game in order to have exactly this, have home field advantage in the first round. They did that, a 21-16 victory in BC last week to finish their season at 12-6. The last 4 games, Calgary won 3 of those 4 games, rounding into playoff form, I would say. Although they only outscored opponents by, again, 2 points on average, 29-27 in those games. They did beat BC in BC. They did lose to this Winnipeg team. Once again, that game was in Winnipeg, which it is not this week. They did beat Winnipeg in Calgary a couple of weeks back, and they also beat Saskatchewan in Calgary. The biggest area of this football game that I think Calgary can exploit to their advantage, and this is going to be a very unfulfilling answer, but we've been here before. As a franchise, this is what the Calgary Stampeders are. They're home playoff games, they're playoff buys, although they didn't get one this year, but they're putting themselves in advantageous positions to win. This is what this franchise does. These are defending Grey Cup champions. They've been there over and over and over again. So it's an unfulfilling answer. It's not really X's and O's, but it's the experience level, and they know they can do this because they've done it before. It's just who they are. If there is a big area of concern for the Stampeders, I think it comes on second down, where Calgary was fairly mediocre this year. They converted at just 47.7% on second down. That was only number 6 in the CFL, and I think it was the worst among the playoff teams. And Winnipeg allowing just 44.9% conversions on second down was only 4th place in the league. But you look at those 2 numbers, and Calgary may struggle a bit here on second down. Winnipeg won 2 of the 3 head-to-head matchups between the Bombers and the Stamps this season. Started in Week 9, a 26-24 victory in Winnipeg. Calgary got revenge on that in Week 19, a 37-33 victory at home, which I think is a similar landscape to what this game's going to look like. And in Week 20, Winnipeg got revenge on that, a 29-28 single-point victory to end their season at home. Both at home and against the West Division this season, Calgary was utterly dominant. 7-2 in their own building, outscoring opponents by 4 points on average, 29-25. And against the West Division, Calgary was 8-2 and outscored West Division opponents by 8 full points, 30-22. You get the job done against the teams you know the best. At home, Calgary had playoff team victories twice over Edmonton. They beat Hamilton, they beat Saskatchewan, and they beat Winnipeg. Those were games in their own building. And the 2 losses against the West Division were both of those games against Winnipeg that were lost by a combined 3 points. Even though the scoring was even money in these games at 26-26, the Blue Bombers did struggle a bit on the road this year, only limping to a 3-6 record away from home. They beat Edmonton in Week 11. That's a playoff win. That's quality. But a couple of weeks before that, they lost in Toronto by a single point. I believe it was 29-28. Winnipeg should not be losing to Toronto under any circumstances. I understand it was the second half of a back-to-back for the Blue Bombers. They had just played a quality opponent the week before, had to cross the country, quote-unquote, to play in Toronto, but they still shouldn't have lost to the Argos. But like Calgary, the Bombers also did do their job against West Division opponents, coming to a 7-3 record, outscoring their opponents in those games by an average of 4 points, 27-23. That included 2 wins over Edmonton, 2 wins over Calgary, and a win over Saskatchewan. What I haven't really mentioned yet is that Bo Levi Mitchell has never lost a playoff start in McMahon Stadium. Can I really go against that? Understanding that Winnipeg can make a claim to the head-to-head results that would justify an upset pick, I don't think I can do it. It's the playoffs, they're a different beast. I don't think there's any money to be made this week betting against the Calgary Stampeders. So let's take Calgary at home to beat the Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Winnipeg has struggled in the playoffs lately. They won a playoff game last year, but before that, you got to go way back to find some playoff success for the Bombers. So we're going to take Calgary here at home in what I think is still an advantageous spot to beat the Bombers. On the line, Winnipeg is a 5.5-point dog on the road in Calgary, and I think that's too many points. This is a spot where I'm going to hedge because I think this is going to be a relatively close football game, not to mention the Stamps were only 5-12-1 against the spread this season. Not a lot of money to be made betting on the Stamps to cover their numbers. Winnipeg, meanwhile, was 12-6. I feel pretty good about taking 5.5 points, so that's what we're going to do. Total in the game set at 49.5 points. I got this capped somewhere around a low to mid 50. It's kind of a lean, I guess, because this is going to be pretty close, but I think I am going to skew over on this number. We're going to go over 49.5 points in the West Division final of Winnipeg and Calgary. There you go, folks. Those are your picks for the division semifinal round of the CFL playoffs for 2019. We'll go over them here with you one more time. I like both the home teams to win the games straight up. I got Montreal beating Edmonton, and I got Calgary beating Winnipeg. I do have Montreal covering 1.5 at home against Edmonton, but I'm hedging my bets in the West and taking Winnipeg plus the 5.5 points. I like the East semifinal to stay under 50 points, and I like the West semifinal to go over 49.5. That's it for me, Justin, Bridgewater's Finest on YouTube, Blockbuster_guy on Twitter, fueled as always by the incredible folks at Nerd Tees, and as promised, here at the end of the video, not only is going to be my CFL fantasy lineup for the division semifinal round, but I've got something else that's kind of interesting for you, featuring a couple of the best cappers in this CFL community. Take a look. Okay, folks, hopefully you have stuck around this long because here are the details on my 2019 CFL Playoffs Bracketology Challenge. So as you can see, we have all of our instructions there for both Phase 1 and Phase 2 of the challenge. In Phase 1, I want you to predict your East Division, West Division, and Grey Cup 107 champions, as well as your Grey Cup 107 most valuable player. In Phase 2, I want you to complete a full March Madness style CFL Playoffs bracketology. Those brackets will be revealed on my Grey Cup video. That'll be part of the content for the Grey Cup video. I've got a couple of the best cappers on Twitter, including Dave MILHOUSE, TBONE, and TK. You've seen Dave and you've seen Mr. TK on the videos thus far earlier this season. They have got it in. They have got their brackets in. Get your brackets in before this week's games. Peace.